Hello, this is Let's Talk About Myths, baby, and I am your host, Liv, who was going to come up with something quippy to say, but it's too much of a spoiler for the first question I'm going to answer today. We're not cutting out that sound because that's part of it too. So I'm just Liv, your host, here with more answers to your questions because I am incredibly long-winded and you guys had so many questions. And it's December, and I haven't been back into a realm where I can write a whole script, so I am thrilled that I can just answer more of your questions, not least because actually this question we're going to start with today is one of the ones I noticed like ages ago when it came in, and I have been really excited to answer it. So honestly, without further ado, more updates to come when I have put my brain back together post-move. For now, let's get right into more of your fascinating questions. Can you talk about the cats in Greece? Another Q&A. Can I talk about the cats in Greece? Well, truly, when I started recording this, I had the squirmy worm that is my recently adopted Greek kitten in my lap. So it seemed like the absolutely perfect place to start today's Q&A episode. And I think there's another question about cats. I'm going to try to find it to make sure that I answer them both. Because cats in Greece, they go along pretty hand in hand these days, but they didn't always. So we'll get into it. First up, this question is from Tamara, who says, can you talk about the cats in Greece? It seems like they're everywhere. As someone who is my cats are only allowed to go outside in their catio and nowhere else person, I hope the roaming Greece cats are well taken care of. Love the show and all the work you put into it. Thank you, and thank you for giving me an opportunity to talk about my new Greek kitten. His name is Anchovy, or Gavros in Greek. Because, well, I mean, there's a whole story. So why don't I tell you all about the cats in Greece while also talking about my new little ridiculous kitten who just got neutered and so is walking around with a little cone on his head, but still has all of the energy that I have ever seen in a living animal in my life. So cats in Greece, they are incredibly common. It is, I mean, I won't pretend like it's this big magical wonderland of cats everywhere. It obviously is a problem both for the cats and the people. But by and large, from my experience, the people of Greece really make the most out of this problem. And I think the cats really benefit. I haven't been anywhere else in Eastern Europe for a long time, so I can't say whether this is widespread, but I can, with a good deal of confidence, talk about the cats in Greece specifically. Like I said, they're everywhere. And like this person noted, Tamara noted in their question, yes, no, they are everywhere. The cats in Greece are kind of a staple, really. Like, they're such a huge part of visiting Greece. You can see all of those TikTok videos and things that go around, like, you know, what I expected from my Greek vacation versus what it was. And it's like beautiful ruins and then cats. For me, when I go to Greece, it's definitely both. So it's a little bit of story time for now, from my experience personally with Greek street cats. So, I mean, obviously I've been going there for a while. A couple of years ago, I found a group called Cats of Theseo, and they are a group who does really amazing charitable work with the cats in specifically the Theseo neighborhood in Athens. Now, if you're not catching that word, it is the modern Greek word for Theseus. So it's a little bit funny / appropriate that is sort of the neighborhood where I found a group to really become an enormous fan of. And again, all the sounds in here, I'm not even going to try to re-record entirely because that is, I think, part of this question is everything about that was Anchovy trying to contribute to this episode while also being a squirmy worm that is a 5-month-old kitten. So Cats of Theseo do some really incredible work. If you are looking for more on the street cats of Greece or looking to help in any way, I recommend you check them out. Theseo is spelled Thissio. There's multiple ways of spelling it in English. Because it's a Greek word, but that's generally it. Cats of Theseo does some incredible work. Irene is sort of the main person associated with it, and she is awesome. And we met, and she took me on a little tour of the cats in that neighborhood, and she knows them all so well. They all have beautiful names, and they all, come running when she comes out with her food and the water, and they take really as good care of the street cats of that neighborhood as possible. They trap when they find one that is injured, and they do their best to help. They trap, neuter, and return as often as possible. Obviously, it is all about funding. They are a group that does it all based on essentially crowdfunding. So if you can and want to help, feel free. I give, and I absolutely love the work that they do. So that's a really good example of what are pretty common in Greece. I mean, certainly in the more populated areas where that can be feasible, but people really do care about the cats, whether, that care is shown in the form of them doing that kind of charitable work where they're like actively, trapping and neutering and keeping the problem from getting worse and ensuring that the cats that are there live as comfortable and happy a life as they can, or just the people who live around there and put out food and water, because that is also incredibly common. People, by and large, in my experience, really do want to care for the cats in their neighborhood. It's really nice. And, it obviously is still not an ideal situation for, the cats, the people, the birds, everything else. But at the same time, like in terms of something that is already a problem, the people really do, I think, make the most out of it and do the work as that they can as much as possible. So the cats, by and large, for the most part, you're going to find that they're pretty well taken care for. The thing about cats, obviously, is that they are incredibly independent. They're not like dogs. To me, I like to phrase like dogs need people. Cats tolerate people. Cats often enjoy people, absolutely. But dogs really need people at this point. Cats are not so domesticated that they can't, for the most part, handle it all themselves. And we respect them for that. But they do get help from the humans wherever possible. And it's generally pretty nice. Now, my little anchovy, you're going to get the little story time because he is perfect and precious. And I think I mentioned in the last Q&A, but you can check the Instagram if you want to see a picture because, again, he's perfect and precious. But story time is that I went to Naxos last June before the group trip with a good friend of mine. And she and I stayed at this place where there were these two cats who we bonded with immediately. Literally, we went to this place, we got our stuff settled, and then we went out for lunch. We brought back a little bit of leftovers, and these two cats just showed up and never left. I mean, obviously we also gave them leftovers, and one of those cats was the first one we met. We fed him anchovies, leftovers, and named him Anchovy. It just seemed like a cute name, and this cat was so precious, little tuxedo, kind of a medium hair, honestly beautiful cat, just the loveliest. Within 5 minutes of meeting him, he was on my lap, just lying down, hi, this is where I am now, thank you. And then the other cat, who was clearly the bonded pair, she's this little black one, and she was super pregnant at the time. We named her Sardine purely because it went with Anchovy, and it was just flippin' adorable. And these cats were inseparable. They were with us all of the time. We ended up getting hit with this absolutely wild heat wave where it was 44 degrees in June. Absolutely abnormal, even for Greece. And there was this period where the cats just slept outside of our door because it was shady and cool. They slept there for 2 days straight. We gave them food and water, and they just didn't leave. It was so cute. And one of them was, like I said, really pregnant. She was this tiny little black gal. Just bopping all around. She loves to climb. Truly the sweetest little girl. And then, we also befriended the man who owned the land there and, who was renting us the space at the time. And so when the time came and little Sardine had her babies, well, he sent us pictures and videos. And she had this litter of these 4 little black kittens and 1 gray. And it didn't take long. We were obsessed. And so, yes, we did go back for this kitten. I mean, lots of other life stuff happened in the in-between, but ultimately, this friend and I ended up moving to Toronto together, getting an apartment together, and then bringing this Greek cat with us, along with my other gal, Squid, who I adopted in the summer, and she is also precious, but she is elusive, like squids tend to be, and by that I mean she's really anxious, and we're getting her comfortable. But Anchovy, he does not know the meaning of the word anxious. He is wild. And a great example of how kittens are often handled in Greece. Because the thing is, obviously, a cat that has spent a large part of its life living on the streets of Greece and being vaguely, cared for in that way that they tend to be, but also just like being out on their own and fending for themselves and getting, cats create colonies for themselves, or they become a part of existing colonies. Like, cats really are these lovely little colony pack animals. And so, it's really not, by and large, it's not the greatest for a cat who has been living that life to then be adopted and become a house cat, because that's just not, that's a really big change for a cat that has grown up with it. But kittens obviously are an exception. And so in this case, we went back for this kitten and we got to experience how it's often handled. Now, we were on an island. It just happens to be that Naxos has quickly become my favorite island in loads of different ways, and that's where we got little Anchovy from. So, very specific island experience. Naxos is a really lovely island. It's touristy, but it's not wildly touristy. Still a lot of locals, and just generally it's the best. But don't tell anyone, because we don't want it becoming not the best. But in any case, so when we were there with the kitten, we obviously had to take him to the vet, and we had to get some paperwork. And so my experience in how, both people, like the guy who owned the land, he was so happy for us to take one. He was like, just absolutely like, yep, no, come here, take one of the kittens, I'll do what I need to do to help you do that. And so we needed rabies vaccination. That's what you need to get one into Canada. And so we were looking into that. So we take him to this vet. The vet ends up chatting with the guy who owns the land, because they are very, they really want to help people adopt kittens and give them a better life, but they also want to ensure that tourists aren't out there like picking up a kitten that is absolutely not, up for being adopted and brought back somewhere. So they're really conscious of lots of different things. So the vet had a whole chat with the owner of the land and ensured that, like, yes, he knew us, he trusted us to take this kitten. That was all fine. And then once that was handled, we brought this kitten in. They give him, the shots that he needed, including the rabies vaccination, and a microchip. They did it all, and they charged us compared to Canada, like almost nothing. It was so great. And they were just so keen to help us. They filled out this whole little, we had to get him an EU passport. Like, really, we just need the rabies vax, but in the EU, that comes in the form of this little passport. So he has this little blue EU passport that's like half Greek and half English, and it's flippin' precious. And they were just so keen. Like, they sat with us. We just sat in this vet's office. He looked like a mountain man who was also, just he was so great. He barely spoke any English, but his one of his the tech that worked with him, her English was great, and we were going back and forth chatting all about this. She absolutely loved his name, Anchovy in Greek, but then of course I say it's Gavros, and then I get a good laugh out of Greek people, which I absolutely love. They give us all of this. This vet has this big old dog who is just hanging out this entire time. The vet looks like Indiana Jones, if he let his hair go wild and kind of had an Einstein vibe. It was just the most wonderful experience. Everyone was so lovely, and they just wanted to help us take this kitten home to a new life in Canada. And also, I have to tell you that the reason I mentioned that there was a big old dog there at the vet, because it was the vet's dog, he looked like, I don't even know, big and fluffy, so hot for Greece, but such a precious guy, and his name was Odysseus. Or Odie. I nearly died. The people were like, well, you are reacting in a bizarre way to this dog's name. And I was like, no, it's so great. It's a sign. Anyway, it was just such a great experience. And that's my experience on, Greek people who want to help the animals. They love the animals. They want to give them a better life where possible, but they also ensure that that's an actual thing that's going to happen, and not just somebody picking up a cat off the street and wanting to take it home, because that's not necessarily going to result in a better life for the cat. So all of that is to say is a super long way of answering this question, but I am so passionate about the cats in Greece, and my little Anchovy is this precious weird little guy, and he's such a perfect example of how it goes, and in my experience with the cats there. So generally, cats in Greece, I think, are by and large taken care of by the people who live around them, by the neighbors, or by groups that are trying to do like bigger good, like Cats of Theseo and lots of other things. But in my experience, they're very much appreciated. Like, you go to a lot of restaurants and like the people working there are not shooing the cats away. Like, the cats get fed at the restaurant. Like, that's just the way it is. It makes me think in North America, like, people are always, you know, like, oh, that would be, you know, the cat would get shooed away as if, like, it was doing something wrong, just, like, existing in the space in which it naturally lives. And over there, it's like, oh, no, this is just the way of life. Like, if the people want to feed it, great. Otherwise, like, they're just around, and, like, nobody is out being an asshole to them for no reason. And it's nice. I don't want to pretend like that is the case everywhere all the time, obviously. But in my experience, for the most part, it's pretty nice for the cats, you know, as far as it goes to be a street cat. It's not a too bad life for them, which is lovely and adorable. This next question is from Francesca, who says, "Hi, I'd love to know your opinion on how colonialist and Christian ideas transformed female deities and their roles in society. You hear a lot of goddesses being under an umbrella of fertility, birth, etc. When is this the true ancient Greek meaning, and when is it a Western religious coverall? Hope this makes sense. This is in relation to Artemis, Persephone, and Hera. Thanks, love the show." Thank you, Francesca. This does make sense, and it's a good question. I would say, like, 50-50. Like, I mean, it's so interesting, because fertility is, like, kind of a running joke with, you know, a certain level of classicists now, like those of us who are, you know, a little bit more critical of the patriarchal ideals, because it's sort of a running thing where some certain types of, like, artifacts or characters, names, things like that, if, like, there's any kind of thing that somebody could latch onto and call it fertility, like, often they will, whether or not there really is any kind of contextual grounding for that comes mostly in artifacts, which I just find to be hilarious, but it's still pretty relevant. When it comes to the goddesses, like, it's tough. I mean, fertility, the thing about, let's talk about the term fertility, because it has this connotation now that is definitely coming from that Western Judeo-Christian, like, ideals that we exist in, but at the same time, it still has a truth and an accuracy in the ancient world. Because I think the best way of thinking about this is to think about fertility in a broader form, like fertility outside of the patriarchy, which is giving of life, right? This creation of life. There is fertility in the earth, that soil grows, and there is fertility, like, it's just in that notion of creating and giving life to nature. And so when you think of it that way, Artemis, Persephone, Hera, absolutely fertility deities. I would say less so Hera. I would instead pop in Demeter there. Hera is, you know, obviously she is a goddess of marriage and birth and things, but a little bit less, in my understanding, on that specifically fertility side. But Artemis, Persephone, Hera, like, they are giving of life in that very distinct way that is inextricably tied from womanhood and just, you know, the ability to create life, whether or not that is in the form of a woman, but that ability to create life. And so, like, these goddesses and more, obviously, are absolutely tied to that notion of fertility, but then that kind of gets lost over time, and it really does get, like, sort of packed down into this notion of patriarchal fertility. And that's where you get this, like, the level of ick, right, with, say, Persephone, and Demeter as well, and also, I mean, countless other goddesses that I can't quite think of, but, like, that level of, like, that sort of pushing fertility into it just being this one level of, like, human bodies creating babies. Like, fertility really truly is so much more than that. As a woman with a functioning uterus who will literally never have a baby, even if it killed me, like, we can be fertile without it being like this thing of like creating a baby for the patriarchy nonsense, right? Like, Persephone is a fertility goddess because she represents the spring and the fertility of the earth and growing life within the earth. But in the general canon of Greek mythology, she never has a child. So she is this fertility goddess without having children. She's a great example of that. Artemis, I would say, little less so because she's not so much a fertility goddess, but she is a goddess of birth. But in that case, that is coming from the very, very like meaningful story where she helps give birth to her own twin brother. And so that is definitely based in the ancient Greek of it all as well. But there are definitely connotations that have come later that link it more to that Judeo-Christian fertility nature of like giving life for a man rather than just giving life, I guess. It's a really interesting question though, because these goddesses are inextricably tied to those things, but over the millennia and centuries, like, we've made those things less important. And so these goddesses seem like, oh, they're just being relegated to like fertility, birth goddesses, like typical woman things, because we have made that fertility less important. We have made it something that men can just utilize, something that men control, right? And so it has become less, but it's still in its core, is this incredibly powerful thing. At its core, it is giving these goddesses this ability to control life and death, with Persephone so specifically, but Demeter as well, right? The entire story of the Homeric hymn to Demeter is this search for her daughter, and how Demeter, in her grief in motherhood and this loss of her daughter, how she retracts the fertility of the earth. She takes that away because she does control it to that degree. And so it is this incredibly powerful thing. I mean, there's a reason why Gaia is the first, kind of physically embodied thing. She is the earth, the giver of all life. And then she is covered over by a man, right? There are all of these stories about these goddesses having this life-giving, vital, like really just the most powerful thing on the planet. They have this life-giving ability within them. And then there are all of these examples of the ways in which the gods sort of subjugate that, and they press it down and down. And, I would say over the hundreds of years of the development of Greek mythology and the general religious practices of ancient Greece, the women started out really, really powerful, and they're just slowly kind of less and less, both literally and figuratively. But then, then Christianity comes along, and to me, the thing that Christianity fucked with in the most detrimental way is the notion of virginity. And of course, that is also inextricably tied to fertility, but it's just that way that Christianity made virginity this thing for men to control, this thing that like is about men. Whereas, the word virgin in Greek it's parthenos. It's where we get the word Parthenon. Like, it is this, ultimately it meant unmarried and childless. It did not mean this like notion of like it didn't mean the Virgin Mary of it all, right? This idea that she could be pregnant without having ever had sex. It was just this notion of unmarried and childless. And so, I would think like, if Mary was a character in Greek mythology, she would not be Parthenos because she had a baby. It has nothing to do with like penetration or some nasty concept of a hymen. Like, it is just about the nature of having a child. I don't know the biblical story because I don't particularly care, but like, I would imagine, like, Joseph's her husband or something, right? Like, that would also make her not a Parthenos, like, even if they hadn't fucked. Because in Greek, it wasn't, I mean, I imagine I could be wrong, and there could be instances where that is more important, but by and large, it's really more about the sort of status of the woman, right? Like, Athena is a Parthenos. She is a virgin, but it is not about how she has never been penetrated. It is about the fact that she is this powerful goddess who does not have a husband and does not have a child. The same applies to Artemis. There is no text source that's like, Athena is a virgin because no one ever penetrated her. Like, absolutely not. That does not exist. That's not the notion of virginity. It goes right back to that's not to say that the ancient Greeks didn't care about penetration. Boy, did they. But it wasn't tied to that kind of purity in the same way that it is under the Christian Bible and religion broadly, and the Christian West. It isn't the same thing. And so the very long-winded, again, because all of my answers are long-winded, the answer is it did affect it, but there is very much still this underlying notion of, like, these are fertility goddesses, absolutely, and we shouldn't take that away from them. The problem is that the concept of fertility has been lessened. It's not that they, aren't as powerful and therefore are relegated to fertility goddesses. It's that the concept of fertility has lost its importance under that Christian umbrella, because the notion of fertility is really about the life-giving nature of all of existence. And that's why there are so many fertility goddesses, because it is all about the fertility of everything, and any kind of life-giving creation is coming from this fertility goddess. I hope that makes sense. This is a little rambly. I'm still getting back into, like, phrasing things like I would normally on the show. It has been a wild couple of weeks. But that was a great question. Thank you. All right, this next one comes from Selma, who said, "Hi, Liv. In your Atlantis series, which I really loved listening to, you talked a little about the eruption of Thera/Santorini. I was wondering if you could tell us more about it and about the site of Akrotiri, or maybe recommend a book about the topic. Love your podcast." Thank you, Selma. Okay. So I don't have a book to recommend on Thera or Akrotiri. I wish I did. So if anyone has any recommendations and you're listening on Spotify, put them in the comments and I can maybe share it somewhere, or generally it will just live there, because I would love to know about books about this as well. But I imagine there isn't. I mean, there is a lot, but it's all probably really heavy archaeological stuff, because the thing about Akrotiri, and I will get more into it, it's all just prehistoric, right? And I don't mean prehistoric like dinosaurs roaming the earth. I mean prehistoric in the way that, like, writing does not survive from that time period, so there is no historical record. And so it's all about the archaeological record and material evidence, and that often ends up with, like, I would say, like, drier sources, unfortunately, because, like, there is no written source that talks about it at all. So that's what makes it very different from Pompeii, right? Because, okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. So Thera, which was so Santorini/Thera, it's still the modern name, only often pronounced Thera, like with an F, is still the name for Santorini. It confuses a lot of tourists. But broadly, the more ancient name is definitely Thera. And so pre-17th century BCE, right? So we're talking almost 4,000 years ago. Before that, the island was one roundish island, presumably roundish, based on what it is now. If you look up Santorini now, it's this cool kind of, like, opposite, like, it's like a half moon shape. And then there's this little island off to the side that's called Theracia. And so essentially it's like this big island was a volcano. And in the 17th century, it erupted and created the 2 little islands that are left and which are now Santorini. Now it's Thera, and Thracia just means like little Thera, which is adorable. But essentially, like, that's what we have now. But the reason why we don't have quite as much information about it is just because it happened so long ago that it, you know, the record doesn't exist. Whereas the more famous Pompeii is happening, you know, 1600, 1700 years later. And so people are actively writing about it, and we have all of this historical record. So because of that, Akrotiri and the eruption of Thera is just a considerably less famous and less well known, but to me, so much more interesting. Now, Pompeii is incredible. I went for the first time last year, so I won't pretend like it's not the most amazing thing, because what makes Pompeii special is so much was preserved. Now, what makes Akrotiri special is that a lot is also preserved. It's just that the preservation of something from the Bronze Age versus something from, you know, the 1st century CE, it's a lot different of what we have left. But Akrotiri is like this mini, considerably older version of Pompeii. It's this town that was preserved by the volcanic eruption. And so, you know, even today you can visit, and it is what exists there now. It's, you know, it's completely covered over and everything because it is so fragile due to its age and the construction of the time and all of that, because we're talking about this incredibly early time period. Now on Thera at the time, they were a Minoan people, so they were connected with Crete to the south. They have a lot of very similar wall paintings and art like that compared to what we find on Crete from the Minoan people. But Akrotiri, because of the eruption, just has so much more preserved. So the wall paintings are life-changing. Just Google the wall paintings of Akrotiri. They are, for the most part, still located in on Santorini in modern Thera at the Archaeological Museum. And I went for the first time a couple years ago, and truly, like, I can't even put into words those wall paintings. They are utterly incredible. The art that they showcase from almost 4,000 years ago is just inconceivable. It's really, really incredible. There are a couple preserved wall paintings that are in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. So anyone who has visited that, you might remember those as well. Really, it's unbelievable. So I don't know quite enough about the history itself, but I know that I am utterly obsessed with what that eruption preserved. And so, yeah, I highly recommend anyone look into it further. Again, I don't have a book recommendation, but I do recommend you just, like, Google your little heart out about Google Santorini. Googling Santorini is going to get you a ton of other stuff. Google Akrotiri and the wall paintings there, and just feel your heart just like full of joy. This next question is from Josh, and he says, I started listening to your podcast when a friend of mine recommended it to me in college. Fast forward 4 years later, and now it is an integral part of my life. Liv, you have no idea how much you have taught me, not only about mythology, but about life itself. Oh, that's really nice. Navigating the world as a 20 to 30-something-year-old is hard, but you always push me to follow my dreams, just like you have. Okay, you're going to make me cry. Okay, my question is about music. I love music, and I was wondering if you had given Epic the Musical. I read all of that, and I'm sorry. I feel like I've already answered this, but I read such a nice message. But I'm going to pull it back because otherwise I'm going to ramble about everyone else's questions. But unfortunately, no, I have not listened to Epic the Musical. I hear it's great. I'm so glad it exists. I'm not a musical gal when I don't have something to watch, because ADHD attention span, but I do know all about it, and it seems really awesome, and I'm so glad that everyone seems to really enjoy it. And thank you, Josh, for that question and all of the ridiculously nice things. I have trouble hearing that level of compliments, but also it means the entire world, so thank you. The next question is from Avo. I don't know how to pronounce it, but thank you. Who's your favorite witch, Medea or Cersei? Medea. Because she took witchcraft to a whole other level, and to me, she's a witch who made herself the witch she was, whereas Cersei was a little bit more born into it. There's nothing wrong with that. Nepotism is fine. No, it's fine. Cersei is not a nepo baby. I'm gonna say that clearly. No, except when she is. But then so is Medea. Anyway, it's fine. That's called being divine. But no, I really enjoy Medea, not least just because we have more of her story. Cersei's story really only exists in the Odyssey, and while it's incredibly fun and interesting, Medea's just is. There's so much more to dig your hands into. And I do love an angry woman. Next question is from May, and I don't have a great answer, so it's going to be quick, but I'm glad you asked it. They said, you've talked to guests about the difference between Euripidean and Sophoclean protagonists in Greek tragedy. Do you know enough about Aeschylus's dramatic style to differentiate between his protagonists and those of the other two surviving tragedians? If so, can you share what makes his style unique? I would say no, but not least because I'm just so obsessed with Euripides and I'm really bad at learning about the other ones. But I have been thinking more and more about returning to some of Aeschylus's work because I'm very interested in digging into more of his work, and also picking apart him versus the other tragedians. So you can expect to see more in the future. But in the meantime, no, not really, because I'm too busy loving Euripides. Okay, I have to skip a question from Doris. It's not because your question isn't great. It's only because it's long and I'm trying to get through a few, but I'm going to try to go back to it sometime. Because thank you. And also we're going to say, just based on your PS at the end, we're going to read this is me rambling. Listeners, I'm going to read just the PS from Doris. And she says, in a previous episode, you talked about the origin of names, so a bit about mine. My parents chose it because of the connection to the name Dorothea, which means gift from God. I'm aware that Doris is Greek in origin, but except that she's an Oceanid and mother of the 50 Nereids, from which I assume the meaning of gift or bounty comes. I don't know anything else about it. That is that is essentially all there is to know about Doris, so you've done incredible work. But I think that while that is all there is to know about her, it really is still important to emphasize that, you're exactly right. She may not have stories or anything, but in terms of this kind of nearly primordial deity of the sea, she was meant to be, incredibly procreative, incredibly, very much a fertility goddess, as we were talking about earlier, right? This gift of life, mother of the 50 Nereids, this Titan goddess who formed so much of the sea, even though we don't have much in the way of stories about her. And that is all I know as well, but I just wanted to emphasize that. And I hope to get back to your questions. It's to the listeners, it's just about the life of a priestess or of a god or goddess. And I don't know an answer to it. And so I want to get back to it when I have more of an answer. So thank you. And then this next one is coming from Imogen, who says, would you ever consider doing an episode about Lord Byron? I think he's a really interesting guy, and I also live in his hometown. I know it's historical and not mythological, and also not ancient at all, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about him and his effect on Greece. I would love to. I would love to speak to someone about Byron and Greece, because when I'm over there, it's so clear how valued he is. And it's really interesting to me. I know that he fought for Greece in one of it might have been the War of Independence for Greece, because he loved it so much there, despite, not being Greek himself. But he kind of became this sort of, local hero of the Greeks because of his dedication to the country, particularly when they were fighting for their independence from the So I've always been really interested in looking into more. His name is is all over the place in Athens. So specifically, there's, hotels named for him and streets and all of these. There's a big statue, I believe. And I will say that at the Temple of Sunion, which is in the southern tip of Attica, so it's like an hour and a half, 2 hours-ish from Athens. It is this temple of Poseidon right on the cliffside overlooking the sea. It's an incredible temple, so I recommend anyone visit. But one of the fun little things you learn when you visit there is that Byron actually scrawled his name on one of the columns. This was really common back then. It's very much like oh my God, the horror now. But even up to a couple hundred years ago, it was pretty common to just still inscribe names on things like that. Even national monuments in that way. But it's really interesting to sort of see that historical record of, for all it's like, oh, you've kind of defaced the temple. I find it to be really an interesting record of, the 2,500 years between when the temple was built and now, and kind of looking at, we don't want to forget that time period and kind of everything that happened in between, and knowing that his name, and so many others are inscribed on a temple like that, I think is a really interesting way of looking at everything in between. Also, at the time, the last time I was there, I was really proud of my camera zoom in ability because I was able to actually find his name on a column, even though obviously you can't get close to them now. So yeah, Byron and Greece are so intertwined. I definitely want to learn more myself. So whenever I do, I'll certainly share it all with you guys. This is one of the other questions I was looking for. So this one comes from Rachel in Olympia. I'm assuming Olympia, Washington, but maybe Greece. Let me know if I'm wrong. She says, what do we know about the relationship between humans and cats in the Hellenic world? Maybe a particular deity or festival associated with them. People were clearly sentimental about their pets and obviously cared about their livestock. But I want to know where cats fit in, especially given the Hellenic fascination with ancient Egypt. And everyone knows ancient Egypt literally worshipped cats. Thanks in advance for anything you can share. Okay, this is going to be only a vaguely disappointing answer because I think it's interesting enough that you shouldn't be disappointed. Cats were not, or rather I should say, domesticated, or whatever form that is, what we now would consider to be a domesticated house cat style, whether, feral or wild or otherwise, but, not a big cat, were not brought to Greece until the Hellenistic period. Isn't that wild? So, they did not really have much of a concept of cats as we know them up until that period. So we are talking, the Hellenistic period, of course, comes after the classical period, which is where my knowledge falls away, because the classical period is where all the playwrights are writing and all of everyone who I know and love is classical and prior. So I don't know much about when cats were brought over. This is another thing. Ooh, actually, this is me having a thought into the microphone, and I'm not going to edit it. Michaela and I were just talking about doing a big series on the Hellenistic period because we haven't talked about it that much, and now I am going to tell her we have to find as much as we can about when cats were introduced to Greece. So thank you. But no, so yeah, the Egyptians, you're quite right. The Egyptians did worship cats. They were very big. And so I imagine that is how cats did eventually get to Greece. But broadly, they did not have cats as we know them. They had big cats, that's why there's lions in multiple myths and things like that. But they did not have, our version of cats. I don't know what to call them because they're not technically house cats, and they're also not feral because feral implies that they were once domesticated and then were no longer. So in any case, what we think of as cats today were not brought over. And so I think that's sort of interesting in itself. So that's all to say there are no deities associated with cats in the broader Greek mythology because there were no cats. Isn't that wild? And so I imagine they went over to Egypt and they were like, wow, these animals, the Egyptians love them. Eventually we got to get them over to Greece. It just took a while. Yeah. So that's the slightly disappointing but equally fascinating answer, and I hope to have more for you soon on when they did come to Greece. Now, there still wouldn't have been, any explicitly Greek deities associated with them, because by the Hellenistic period, they're really done creating and imagining new deities. They likely were, would have instead sort of taken on the Egyptian worship, or in some way Egyptian associations, and kind of Hellenized it, but they wouldn't have had their own. But at the same time, like, I don't know of any kind of references to Bastet, the Egyptian god of cats. I don't know of any kind of references in Greece either. So I would love to know more. Hopefully you can stay tuned for more on cats in Greece, and just cats broadly. We can talk about cats as much as possible. All right, this next question comes from Kai, and he says, first up, love the show, and you're fully responsible for me starting a new special interest. Yay, neurodiversity! That was in the message, but I agree. Yay, neurodiversity! Yay, special obsessive interests! I'm going to Rome next August, pray for me in the heat, for 4 days. I'm so excited, but it's my first solo trip. Any advice for solo travel or Rome in general? Have a great day. Thank you, Kai. Okay. Rome. So I went to Rome last winter, and I hadn't been since I was quite young. And by that I mean, it turns out when you get old, quite young is like 20. But so I hadn't been in ages, and I went for a few days last year, and August should be interesting. I was there in January, so that was a much more comfortable temperature. But Rome is so interesting. Here. Sorry, guys. This is where my brain's at right now. I will say the one thing that I learned in Rome the hard way is that, so the Colosseum, obviously you should see the Colosseum because you're not ridiculous, and why would you not go there? So go to the Colosseum, but buy in advance, book tickets to go beneath, because I won't say recently, but it had to have been like a decade ago, but the last time I had gone to Rome, you couldn't go down into the sort of the kind of catacombs underneath, right? Like, so the floor is obviously gone, and so when you're in the Colosseum, you can just see the sort of hallways and walkways that were underneath the floor, and which they used to transport, gladiators and bestiarii and the animals themselves that they fought, and anything else that they were messing around with in the Colosseum. And a while back, they preserved it in a way where they were allowing people to go down there and actually like walk through parts of it, which is so cool. And so I was so excited because I had the last time I'd been there was like I don't even know how long ago, but you weren't able to. And so Jenny Williamson of Ancient History Fangirl, she and I were over there, and we were like so pumped. And we go to the Colosseum, and it just turns out you need a different ticket, and those are like very limited. So you have to book them in advance, and there's time periods and all of that. And that's so reasonable in hindsight, because you're going like into this newly preserved area that is like obviously much more fragile, and they're being really careful with it. So they're not just letting everyone who goes into the Colosseum go down there. So you need to buy a different ticket, and they sell out. So buy that in advance. Don't miss out like I did. And just so learn from me there. And otherwise, dedicate like a good old like day to the Colosseum and the Forum and everything around there, because there's just so much to see. The Capitoline Museum is underrated and very cool, and it's very close to the Colosseum and all of that. It's very, very interesting museum to see. The Pantheon is also just utterly incredible. There's just there's so many ruins to see in Rome, so it's kind of hard to fit it all in. So I would say maybe do your research ahead of time and what you do want to see, because Rome specifically, like, you could be there for a week and see things all day every day and still not see it all. So prioritize, I would say, but definitely like that Colosseum tip, learn from me. And also enjoy and stay cool. It'll be really fun. As for a solo trip, because people ask me about that a lot, and there are some questions that I've received that I did skip in here. I apologize. Questions about, what to see in Greece and things. I always want to talk more about that. So maybe I'll be able to fit it into a future episode. Maybe I'll just do a whole episode about, what to see or what I've seen over there. It's just so hard to give, recommendations because it totally depends on what people want to see. So, I won't dive into Greece yet, like holding myself back from being like, but here are all the things I love. But maybe that's for a future episode. In the meantime, solo travel, I love it. I really do love it. I am primarily traveling in Greece, and I can say that I rarely, if ever, feel unsafe or concerned. Like, I'm also a person who's lived in big cities a lot for many years, so I live with a certain level of like awareness, and I think that's important. But this is not to say that anyone in my questions has suggested anything like this, but I feel like specifically North Americans, like we have this bizarre idea that like when we leave North America, we're like inherently unsafe, and like somehow we need to like, protect our wallets more, and protect our money more, and protect our passport, whatever, like all of these things that like you should be doing generally, like anytime you travel, and it doesn't matter like where you're going. You're not inherently less safe in Europe than you are in North America, like particularly not south of the border. Like, I feel a lot more safe in Greece than I do traveling in the States. And so I just say, like, don't like leave your Western preconceptions behind, like this idea that North America is like this weird little bubble. I mean, we are a weird little bubble, but like not in a good way. Like traveling to Europe, especially on your own, like I think it really opens up your mind to just like the rest of the world. And I think that's so important. It's really fun, especially, I mean, Rome is really good. It's really accessible, in terms of like getting to the airport and all around. And I love walking around a city like Rome, or, when I'm traveling in Greece, just walking and kind of see what you can get or where you can get to. That did just lead me to another Roman tip, which is that there is a cat sanctuary amidst this one set of ruins. I'm going to forget what it's actually called. But you can Google cat sanctuary ruins and you're going to find it. And I'm forgetting what it's called because Jen and Jenny, again, of Ancient History Fangirl, just kept referring it to the Julius Caesar's cat sanctuary. Not what it's called, but it is generally in the area where he was killed. And so I understand why they call it that. But it does also mean that their phrasing then sticks in my head and I forget what things are actually called. But I do recommend checking that out because you get both some interesting Roman ruins and a cat sanctuary. And isn't that adorable? Okay, we're on to the last question from Sky. And they said, do you think it's possible that the Zeus coup was written out of fear of the women, that the women would do the same to the men in charge? Because it kind of stands out next to the other myths, and I can't explain why. This would support my theory that the women of the time would describe Hera very differently than the myths. Firstly, and most importantly, I agree with you 1010% that the women of the time would describe Hera very differently from the myths. I think that they would describe everything very differently from the surviving sources that we have. Oh, Hera so specifically. Yeah, so specifically. I think Hera is one of the most fascinatingly, like, I don't know how to describe it. I don't want to say damaged, but like just one of the characters who is most interesting to examine, of like just how much of her character and her story is coming from the men instead of like literally anywhere else, because she just feels like this caricature of a jealous wife, right? She feels like a woman written by a man in this really distinct way. Like a lot of them do, but Hera, yeah. And the coup is so interesting too because it is not at all a well-preserved story. Like it basically only survives as this little bit in the Iliad where it's like it's really the story of Hera trying to take down Zeus, of her, essentially orchestrating what is ultimately a failed coup against Zeus, it really only survives as a kind of explanatory note for why Thetis is on Zeus's good side, because Thetis is the one who kind of rescues him, stops the coup. She brings in one of the Hecatonchires to save Zeus, essentially. And so it's this just this kind of explanatory note of why Zeus owes Thetis, and why he then has to help her in her quest to save Achilles in the Iliad. And so it's a really interesting way to present this notion that is ultimately at its core incredibly subversive. This idea that the woman who is so famously kind of Zeus's jealous, angry sidekick, who just is sort of along for the ride in his terror show of a rule, it gives her this incredibly important status of she tried, she stood up against him, she worked with the others, she collaborated, and they really, there was an attempted coup. And how interesting is that? And it seems to me that it's not unrelated that it doesn't survive elsewhere, that it isn't this well told story. It makes me think of Medusa as well. These stories where women really are a threat to men and the patriarchal order. Those stories tend to either not survive or be slowly changed and manipulated over time so as to lose their essence. Like the Medusa, who is this a snarling head who can turn everyone to stone and is just this terrifying beast. That is a manipulation meant to ensure that a woman who could defend herself against a man it is unrealistic, as if they don't want anyone imagining that that's possible, and so the story is changed. Or in the case of Hera, it's not presented as this big feat. She is rarely ever referenced about her. It's not something that survives in any super strong or meaningful way. And because of course, because that is it is a threat to the ruling order to suggest that the wife of a man like Zeus could stand up to him and try to fight back against his tyranny, right? And I think I've been thinking about that more and more about, when it comes to so many different stories and just how much we might be able to kind of see remnants of those decisions, whether they were, conscious or otherwise, or just this this vague, the men were afraid, and so they kind of rewrote everything to ensure that women did not have this example to go off of, right? I think it applies to so many different stories, and it's something where the more I think about it, the more I want to sort of dive into that in a kind of more meaningful way. So I'm glad you mentioned that, because I rarely even think about that moment with Hera, because it is so minimal. It survives in such a minuscule kind of way. It really is not meant to be this important moment in the larger mythos. And why not? What does it say that it wasn't? And the same to me goes for Medusa, right? While her story, she as a character survived, is so famous, but particularly her as a head, right? As a weapon rather than a defense mechanism. And what does it say? That the story of actually her being killed purely because she had the ability to defend herself against a man, that story barely survives in any kind of meaningful way. And what does that say about the storytellers and then also the people who had to make these conscious decisions to preserve these works over centuries and millennia even? Everything comes back to the patriarchy, really. Everything. And I could talk about it forever, but I will not. Ultimately I will, but not today. This podcast will go on forever of just me just raging about all the different reasons why the patriarchy needs to be taken down from the inside, torn apart piece by piece. And with it, we will take capitalism. With it, we will take Western supremacy and we'll grind them into a dust, blow it into the wind, and then from what's left, we will build a world of equality where people actually get to elect their rulers, and those rulers actually have to serve the people. Not the false, nonsensical form of democracy we have in the West now, where we are led to believe that we elect our rulers and that they actually have to work for us. But in practice, that is laughable in 90% of cases. No, we're gonna just crumble all of that to dust and build something fresh and new and socialist as shit. I've been having a time lately. This has been fun. Thank you all so much. Every once in a while, I like to give you just a particularly unhinged episode of ranting and raving because, gods, it's fun, particularly when the world is on fire and we are just watching as the West is allowed to... I don't even know how to get into what's happening right now in the Middle East, and just the way that the West is just allowed to kill and destroy cities and people with utter impunity because the propaganda has just worked far too well. So anyway, I'll be back with more soon, and together we'll take down the ruling Western order and the patriarchy with it. Let's Talk About Myths, Baby is written and produced by me, Liv Albert. Michaela Penguish is the Hermes to my Olympians, my producer. She's utterly wonderful. Select music in this episode was by Luke Chaos. Listen on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Sign up for the newsletter, which I will send again soon, and keep an eye out for ad-free subscription options. I am coming up with a lot of incredibly fun stuff. It's all coming very soon. I've gotten merch made. I'm just waiting for it to arrive. We're going to be handling everything in-house. Oh, we're going to take down capitalism. I'll stop. I am Liv, and I love this shit. Thank you all so much for coming along with me on this ride for however long you have been. Wow, it's been a time. I absolutely love that I can say all of this into a microphone and it actually gets across, and I just have connected with so many people who think similarly because we all have eyes and souls and, you know, free Palestine, hands off Lebanon. Let the Syrian people actually get what the Syrian people want and not what the West wants, and fuck settler colonialism, land back, and down with Western supremacy. All right, again, I'm Liv and I love this shit.